Hey everybody, and welcome to the Halfie Project podcast. My name is Becky, and sitting adjacent to me is Cedric Skysetti.
What's up, everyone?
We are in a new set, as you can see, because now we have returned back to the YouTube channel. The last two episodes were audio only, but the real MVPs of this podcast would know that.
Of course.
Yeah.
And who doesn't want to watch two beautiful people
Ew.
talking?
Why would you describe us like this?
Yeah, just if you're a podcast listener, audio only, and if you weren't aware, we do have the YouTube version.
Yes, we do.
Essentially the same version, but in video format.
Yeah, because some people like to
out.
visually watch and see the expressions that we're making. But something I've discovered while editing only the audio version of the podcast, how much fun it is to edit that.
Really?
There's so much you can do that's just audio, right?
I suppose.
Yeah.
But I don't know because I've never edited just an audio podcast. So
it's different. Like the pacing's different, and you're not distracted by other things. This is why I like podcasts so much. That's just audio only. Yeah. I mean, give us a good example of things that you can do on an audio only podcast, but you can't do on a video form.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can make a bunch of faces and do crazy things.
Of course, and no one would have any idea. But here now we have too many witnesses. You're all witnesses. Well, speaking of witnesses, there are some things in life where a witness is legally required.
Oh, transition.
Thank you.
Woo.
And one of those things where it's supposed to be two witnesses for something to legally come into being would be a marriage, right?
That's right.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, it's not really about marriage, is it? But it is something that's tied into that here in Korea. I feel like we're going to take a pretty dark turn very abruptly. But actually, specifically what we're going to talk about is foreign brides in Korea. And we're going to, I guess, break down that term a little bit more very shortly, because I think there's going to be some of our listeners who are like, oh yeah, I'm a foreign bride in Korea. I'm a foreign girl who married a Korean guy. And you might find yourself, I fall in that category. But we're going to be talking very specifically about when we're talking about these quote unquote foreign brides.
Yeah, totally. I think this is an important topic because it's very closely related to the Halfie Project, and also for a lot of people out there who may not be aware that this sort of thing goes on in Korea especially. And, I'm sure this goes on in many other parts of the world. But because this is closely related to us here and we're living here, and it's something that you and we actually don't see this with our own eyes per se.
Well, we might and just not be aware of it.
Exactly. So it's not like out in the open or very just obvious, but it's actually more rampant than anyone would probably realize.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think to get people to grasp what exactly we're talking about, we're going to share with you 3 scenarios out of, I'm sure, the thousands, but 3 that actually reached the public eye and really started to spark this conversation about problems with foreign brides in Korea. Now, don't jump out of your seats yet when I say problems with foreign brides, okay? We're talking about very specific things here. So it's this case. In 2018, there was a young Vietnamese woman. She was 29 years old, and she married a Korean man who was in his 50s. He came to Vietnam, and they married in Vietnam in front of her family there. And she spoke only Vietnamese. He spoke only Korean. She moved to South Korea a couple months later. I think it was 7 months later. 3 months later, she was murdered by her husband, who stabbed her 10 times. He was sentenced to 15 years of prison. This was one case. Let's talk about a second case.
So there was a viral video that broke out in 2019 about a 36-year-old South Korean man who physically and verbally abused his Vietnamese wife. Now, I remember hearing about this I was living in Korea at the time, but not only did I hear about it, but it made global headlines.
Yeah.
So people all over the world were made aware of the situation. And this video basically showed the man slapping, kicking, and repeatedly punching his wife in the head and in the stomach as he yelled, "You are not in Vietnam."
Right. In front of their child.
In front of their
child.
2-year-old son.
Yeah.
So, this incident made big headlines.
Yeah.
Fortunately, she did not pass away. Not that I'm aware of, because I know that they put her in some sort of a like a protective custody, or like
a
maybe
safe
home.
house.
Yeah, something like that.
Here's another case. It was in 2010. A 20-year-old, again, Vietnamese woman. She married a 47-year-old Korean man. And 8 days after arriving to Korea, she was murdered by him. And what came to light afterwards is that he had a history of mental illness. I even found a record that said 57 times he had been medicated as having schizophrenia.
Dang.
When she was, I will say, paired with him, she did not know this about his mental illness. Now, we bring up these 3 cases not because they are the most horrible cases or the most brutal cases in these scenarios, but because they are the ones that got the most public attention. And especially in the 2010 case, there was some change that happened after that, thank goodness. But what I find quite surprising is that the 3 cases that really captured our attention are so recent, when in fact, this has been going on for quite a number of years. So today we are going to talk about this concept of foreign brides. And I really want to be careful now when we are using the words foreign bride, because when you say in Korean, we usually just say what? 국제 결혼, international marriage, which is quite a broad category, right? You can have so many people, obviously today, who come to Korea as students, let's say, or to here to work, fall in love with Korean native, local, and they get married. And those can be also 국제 결혼. But in this case, when we're talking about foreign brides, these are in particular women who are from, it could be, of course, any country, but as we see, it's primarily focused in a number of Southeast Asian countries, some Central Asian countries. And in a way, they go through, what would you call that? A business? Like
a service.
A broker.
Yeah, matchmaking service or marriage broker. Yeah, so there are these registered businesses essentially in Korea where they set up these Korean men with primarily international women. And this is, again, mostly, from my knowledge, in these Southeast Asian or Central Asian countries.
Yeah.
I guess mainly from like Vietnam, and there's some from Philippines, some from China. And there's a history behind that, which I'm sure we can get into.
We will.
But so there's still a lot of these companies that are registered today,
Yes.
close to 300, I believe.
So we're going to talk about the brokers in particular, these marriage brokers. But first, let me just share a couple of stats about international marriage here in Korea. So in 2018, it said about 16,608 Korean men and foreigner women married. As you can see, I'm emphasizing Korean man and a foreigner woman. And 28% of all those marriages in 2018 were, again, it was with a Korean man and a Vietnamese bride. 28% of those marriages, and this is the 2018 stats. And then the distribution of foreign brides in South Korea in 2019. I pulled up this graph and I got this off of, I think it was CNN, where they had a really great article about this that you can check out. But from foreign brides, out of all the foreign brides in South Korea in 2019, it says approximately 3% were Cambodian, about 3.38% were American, and then we have 4.6% were Filipino, 5% were Japanese. Then it jumps to about 11.6% were Thai. There's a 15% category where it's just others. Then we have about 20.6% Chinese. And then another big jump to almost 38% as Vietnamese women. So you can see that a big percentage of foreign brides in South Korea tend to be Vietnamese. And there's a reason for that. do we want to talk specifically about Vietnam yet, or should I just continue with my stats, you think?
I think we can continue.
Okay. So, well, like I said, there's a big reason for that. And that is because, according to these marriage matchmaking businesses, Vietnamese brides are economic. It's not as expensive to, and I'm a bit loath to use this word, but to purchase a bride from Vietnam. So I pulled up from the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, and they had a study in 2017 that's talking about this international marriage matchmaking business. And it says women from Uzbekistan are most expensive, costing an average of 18.3 million won per person. So 18.3 million won is like 19,000 USD.
It would be...
Or a little less than that,
yeah,
right? Like
less,
17,000?
something, yeah. About 17,000.
Then Philippines is about 15.2 million won, so maybe 14,000. Cambodia is 14.4 million won, and Vietnam is 14.2 million won. And China is 10.7 million won. So actually, it didn't originally started where they were trying to get women who are ethnically Korean, but from China.
Right,
That
in
was
the
initially,
1980s.
right? How it began. But as you can see, there are costs to having an international marriage through these matchmaking businesses. So the big question we need to ask then is, okay, because to maybe to us, it sounds a little bit unusual to find a husband this route, to get married in such a way, to have money being such a central aspect to getting married, right? To some of us, I think it might feel like, whoa, that's too financially speaking. Marriage is about love, right? So why then do these women come to Korea, and why are they getting married?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons that we can go through, but I think the central theme in most of these situations, not necessarily all, is the fact that these women, they're looking for an escape. They're looking for an escape from their current situation or their economic hardship, because they tend to come from places where they're either poor or they don't have any resources. And so they figure that this might be their way out. And it's somewhat of a mutual, I mean, I can put it like this, even though they probably don't necessarily look at it like this. It's kind of like a mutual business relationship. Like, you know, we agree to come into contract to marry each other, and you benefit, Korean man, by having a wife who will do whatever she needs to do.
According to the expectations.
Yeah,
right?
But also I get to move to a better country, upgrade my life, and then potentially work.
Your working visa.
Right. I can make money, and then also for many people, many women, they get to send money back to families at home because the power of the Korean won and what they're able to make here would be much better than what they can make at home. So that's that seems to be sort of the common denominator in a lot of these situations. But there are also, you know, other reasons why I think some of these foreign brides will come to marry Korean men, even under these circumstances.
Yeah. Something I find very interesting is what I've noticed in many of these countries where they are getting foreign brides, like Vietnam or Philippines or Thailand, is a love of K-dramas. Korean dramas, you know, are very, very popular there. And I think that media can portray a very false image of what getting married to a Korean man might look like. These expectations of what life could be. And in reality, it is oftentimes quite different. Now, we really, really want to emphasize that, of course, there are going to be those who really do genuinely mean well when they want to find a bride in Vietnam, let's say.
Sure, yeah.
And it works out well, and they're happy, and they do end up in love, or just grow to really care for each other. Those cases do exist.
Right. And even so much so that a lot of these Vietnamese prospective brides, they hear from their friends or people that they know that have come over to Korea they marry their oppa or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, they marry their spouse and they have a good situation. Like maybe their life has been made better. And so they hear from people they know or their friends. And so they want the same thing for their life. But their situation might turn out to be different.
That's right. We are not discounting those cases. So if you are one of those women who have a very similar experience, we are not discounting that experience, but we are saying that there have been some serious issues and there are reasons for that. And we're going to get into that a bit more a little bit later on. So let's look on the flip side then. Why would Korean men want to marry these migrant brides?
That's a good question. I mean, for one, there's a huge gender imbalance in the context of where these men are. Mm-hmm. So most of these men come from the countryside, the rural areas of Korea. So we're not talking about Seoul or Busan or some of these bigger cities, but we're talking about even towns that I don't even know of. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so there is a gender imbalance in that to start with, there are less girls or less females in the area to begin with because it's a smaller population. Uh-huh. But a lot of the females, they tend to escape the countryside, if you will, and they'll go and find work in the city. And so these guys, they're just kind of growing older and their pool is very small.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of their, I guess, next best option. So that's one of the reasons, one out of the many potential reasons.
Yeah, I mean, we have this kind of mass exodus of the rural areas into the cities. I mean, we see Seoul is that's the example of it. We see all these outlying what used to be the rich agricultural farming lifestyles, and now everyone moves into Seoul because this is where it's all happening. Mm-hmm. You can get your education here. You can meet so many different kinds of people, different job opportunities. Getting married. This is a big reason actually why a lot of women who are born in rural areas come into the city, because of the prospects of meeting, an educated guy who's got a good career as opposed to living in the rural areas.
Right. And so you might wonder, well, why don't these guys come to the city to work?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, a lot of these guys, I mean, they may not be well educated because Korea economically and educationally is so competitive. And so they may not have had the same resources or the same type of education, which consequently allows them or doesn't allow them to have the same opportunities.
Yeah.
So that could be one reason. So they feel stuck in where they are. And also another reason could be they might be the firstborn son.
Yeah.
And it's still tradition in their family that the firstborn will stay and take care of the aging parents.
That's right.
So that's another big reason. And so it's just this family responsibility that's built into the culture. I think Korea is moving away from that generally in terms of like the responsibility or taking care of the older generation, like your parents. But I think that's still a prominent part of the culture.
Sure. And
just not as strong as before.
We're talking about countryside versus in the city life. Right. Because of course there's a different change, or I suppose even westernization of thought that happens inside of the city life that's more globalized and connected with the outside world. But if you're living in a more rural area and your primary focus would be family or your tradition or more conservative values, undoubtedly you're not going to be so quick to change the way that you have been living or the way that you grew up. Another thing, of course, besides this just concept of, women moving into the city for jobs and marriage and then men staying behind to take care of the family due to Confucian expectations. But also, I read that in the 1980s and the 1990s, due to sex-selective abortions, there's a greater proportion of males that were born during that time as opposed to females. So now this generation is in the marriage market, and there's less opportunity to meet women simply on the fact that there are just less women.
Right. Wow. That makes a lot of sense because, again, it's a patriarchal type of society. Mm-hmm. And so on top of that, and this might be, surprising to many people, but, there were a lot of government subsidies that were
this surprised me.
Given out in the 80s and 90s. And even to this day in some of the rural areas, there's still subsidies that are given out to, it's sort of twofold, I guess, to these marriage brokers and institutions, but also directly to these Korean men. So they're incentivized. They're incentivized for a Korean man who's never been married to go and get married, and we'll give you 5 million won, which is like 4,700 ish.
Yeah.
So
USD.
USD. So I think it's not as prevalent as it once was. But even, for example, South Jeolla province,
Cholla?
Jeolla,
Oh, okay, Jeolla, yeah.
offers, even to this day, offers men older than 35 who's never been married 5 million won, a subsidy for marrying a foreign wife.
Yeah,
Not even just
that's the qualification.
a foreign wife, and they're able to qualify by presenting an official marriage certificate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's another, I guess, reason or incentive for some of these men to get married. And it's all rooted in the fact that Korea is just not marrying. They're not having families.
Mm-hmm. The population is rapidly aging, and we have a gender disimbalance. This kind of, all of those reasons combined together. I mean, if you look at it from face value, if the government is like, hey, okay, let's think about you. Let's imagine that you were living out in the countryside and you were taking care of your parents and you were farming the land.
What's so funny
and
about that?
it's not funny. It's just imagining you. And, you're hanging out on your farm in Jeolla province. And then a government official is like, hey, you're like 35 now, right? I mean, you look way younger because we know that you take good care of your skin and you work out every day. But I know your real age because I'm a government official here and, you're at the district office and stuff. It's about time you got married. And you're like, yeah, that would be great. I'd love to get married. And then they're like, hey, you should also have lots of kids because you're a good looking guy and you should have good looking kids too. Oh, great. And then you're like, yeah, that would be great too. I'd really love to do that. And they're like, you know what? How about this? You get yourself a wife and we'll pay you. That sounds great on face value.
Heck yeah, I'd do it.
Yeah, see, on face value, sounds awesome. But obviously, there's a whole host of issues that come up behind that.
Yeah.
That will come up, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, indeed. So we did talk a little bit about how these marriages happen, but let's talk a little bit more about the marriage brokers or matchmakers.
Okay, yeah, this is. I think it's important for people to understand how this is actually happening, right? Because we like to talk about it on this grand, open, big scale, like, oh, just go to Vietnam and get a wife. But in reality, there's a whole lot of, I guess, steps or machinery in play to make this happen.
Yeah. As we mentioned, in the 1980s, local governments began to subsidize private marriage brokers who would introduce single farmers to ethnically Korean women in China. And these brokers were actually paid about 46 million won per marriage, which at the time was about 3,800 USD to 5,700 USD. So, these brokers obviously were incentivized to make these connections happen. And again, this was an attempt to address the aging population issue.
Yeah.
And decades later, brokers began matchmaking non-ethnically Korean brides to Korean men. And this really fueled the broker industry, so much so that by May of 2019, there were 380 matchmaking agencies registered in Korea. So, I have to think, are there like these under the table or like unofficial matchmaking agencies as well? And not only that, but probably like personal connections and personal introductions, I'm sure play a part in this.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Sure.
When I was in Uzbekistan, and I can't, back this up with evidence, but I was in Uzbekistan and I was hanging out at this hotel. And I remember seeing at the table back nearby me, there was a young woman. She was Uzbek, very pretty girl. And then this guy next to her who was also Uzbek, but he could speak in Korean. I could hear him speaking in Korean. And then there was an elderly Korean man across the table. By elderly, I don't mean he was like, decrepit, but in comparison to her, she was quite youthful, maybe 20s. And he had to have been at least in his 50s. And he was sitting on the opposite side of the table. And of course, I can only hear one half of the conversation in Korean and I can't understand Uzbek language. And the guy was saying to the Korean man, oh, I'm her oppa, I'm her brother. And then he would speak to her. And then he would look at the Korean guy and say like, yeah. And I couldn't quite understand everything very well at that time. But I had a kind of itching feeling like, is this guy really her brother? And why on earth are they having a weird date here? And who is that guy? Because it did feel like some kind of transaction was going on. This was the feeling that I had as I was watching this kind of happen pretty close to me. And it was only years later when I learned more about this, and I thought, I think I think he was a marriage broker. I don't think he was the real brother, because she obviously didn't speak Korean, so she didn't know what he was saying. And I think that guy was there to marry her. This is kind of the feeling I had after all of these years.
Yeah, I guess hindsight is 2020, realizing that now with what you know. I've got to wonder. I mean, you just witnessed that happenstance, so that
it was totally out in the open. It wasn't
right.
Like a secret thing.
Yeah, so I have to wonder again. Is this something that just happens on the daily?
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
And I have another quick story to tell you.
Oh,
in university, there was a girl I knew. She was Uzbek. She was really pretty, and very young. I distinctly remember that because I actually thought she was too young to be in our class. I was like, how old are you? But she was already married when. At that time, I was, 19, I think, 19, 20. And she had to have been, I guess, 18 or 19. And she would talk about her husband. And I was like, wait a minute. I just felt very kind of off to me. She had no photos of him. She would talk about him, but she never told us what he did. She never told us how old he was. Like, nothing. And then she attended school with me for about a year, and we were friends on Facebook, and she didn't really post too much. And then all of a sudden I see the next year she's got a baby, but the baby was already like 2 years old. And so I also found that a little odd and suspicious. And, I left her messages. Oh, your baby is so cute. It's so good to see you here. I hope we can meet sometime. And she was always very friendly and nice with me. And then one day she just stopped posting on Facebook. But I remember finding it very incongruent with what I knew of her, and then the things that I was seeing kind of playing out in photos, or what I would piece together from the things that she said.
So she had to have had the baby prior to you meeting her.
Me meeting her at school. Yeah. So I also found that a little bit odd. But again, I have no evidence. I could totally be wrong. The baby might have been just born, really, really big. So that is also a possibility. But these are just instances that have stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, I have no cool stories about this, unfortunately.
Not
Personal
unfortunately.
stories.
I mean, it's good. It's better. I think the less that this is happening,
that's true,
the better. I mean, if people are getting into bad situations due to this. Now, so I feel like when we're talking about this, we talk about in the terms of like payments, brokers, subsidies. They're very professional words. But if you really break it down, you will have some people who say, what this actually is just human trafficking. You are just paying a fee to get a woman to fulfill a certain need. But these women oftentimes, now things have changed a little bit, but at the time, they don't know who this guy is. There have been cases, where the men would just come and they'd have a room of women and he would just pick the one he wanted.
Right.
What is that? That is not, in my opinion, the basis for a happy marriage. But I could be wrong, in some circumstances. But these women just come, or they're taken sometimes, or forcibly entering into this marriage contract out of some necessity or lack that they're having current situation and hoping for a better future. So as you can already see, there is a power disbalance existing. So a lot of times these foreign brides in Korea are very vulnerable to domestic abuse. And we can see clearly why.
Right.
If you look into these situation and really what's going on behind the scenes. So National Human Rights Commission of Korea survey in 2017, they conducted a survey with about 920 foreign brides. 42% of them reported domestic violence. 42%, almost half. My goodness. And then even worse, it continues. 81% reported verbal abuse, 38% reported physical abuse, and 27% forced to cut ties with the motherland. In comparison, a survey by the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in 2019 surveyed South Korean women, and they said about 29% of them were victims of domestic abuse, which is already horrific. But if you're thinking 42% of these foreign brides, and a lot of times these foreign brides don't have any rights away from their husband,
Right.
while these South Korean women do.
Right. I mean, I think that is one of the big issues of a lot of these foreign brides who succumb to this sort of violence or abuse is they don't have too many options. It's so the thing is they're able to, if it's a legitimate marriage, they're able to, like the spouse is able to get an F6 visa, I believe it is.
Okay.
But she's able to get a visa that allows her to live here because she's tied to her husband. But what if the marriage dissolves and she's the one that's like, you know what, I don't want to be married anymore? Well, she has to pack her bags and go back to her country.
Yeah.
She can't just stay here.
Yeah.
Now,
because
I think
he sponsors the visa.
Exactly. Or so I think that is one of the reasons why a lot of women do stay silent. Or, in the case of this survey, I'm sure it was very anonymous. But, the wives understand that they can really anger their husband. And then that's it. They have to go back or they might suffer more abuse. So I think that's one of the reasons why they just stay silent. Now, I do know that in certain cases when, let's just say the marriage dissolves, and if the wife can prove that it is the fault of the husband, say through abuse or something like that, then there is a little bit of leeway for the foreign bride to stay here, to get up on her feet, especially if she has a child. But I think she really, in that time period, I don't know how long it is, maybe a year or two, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows, but like she has that time period to figure out what she's going to do apart from her husband, because she will likely have to try to find another way to stay here, another visa to survive off of.
Right.
Yeah. So all in all, though, it's really at a disadvantage for the foreign bride if anything goes wrong with the marriage.
Yeah.
So she can't work here. She can't live here.
And oftentimes through these marriage brokers, the men are allowed to ask as many questions as they like. They can, ask this and that and this and have this information. But oftentimes the women don't get to ask questions about the men who are interested in her. And we saw in that earlier case in the issue of the history of mental health that she didn't know that. That information was not shown to her. And there are many cases where, now it has changed through the marriage brokers, but many cases prior where the women didn't even speak Korean whatsoever, or the men didn't even speak her native language either. So there was, no communication to begin with. So that is also, of course, a huge issue in trying to establish, will this be a healthy relationship or not?
Right.
So yeah, these women oftentimes stay silent. A lot of it has to do with the visa sponsorship, because I think still people who get married, are they even able to get their own citizenship through marriage? It's not, right? Is that even possible anywhere?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I think eventually she could qualify for a citizenship. I do remember reading something about that, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. Yeah. So we have these communication issues. We have the sponsorship issues. There's already a lot of gender discrimination that exists here in Korea. I would like to point out, according to the 2020 World Economic Forum's latest Global Gender Gap Report, South Korea actually ranks among the lowest in the OECD due to unequal political and employment opportunities for women. So there's a huge gender discrimination that is existing here. Also, on top of that, we have racism that also exists in Korea. And so these women, these migrant brides, are not only facing language barriers, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, but there are also these institutional issues that are in play here that is giving these Korean men far more power over the women.
Right. Like how is a woman going to report any domestic abuse when she can't speak Korean and she doesn't know who to call? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of this power disbalance. I know I keep saying that over and over again, but it's a real thing, and it's very, very multi-layered. I found this, I believe, Ha Young-suk. So she's the head of Korea Women Migrants Human Rights Center. And this quote that I pulled says, Koreans often express a sense of inferiority to the West, even defining themselves as victims of racism, but act superior to people from countries where economic conditions are not as high as Korea. And as we can see, where a majority of these countries where migrant brides are being selected, they are countries that, economically speaking, are at a disadvantage compared to Korea. So already we have this sense of superiority and inferiority complexes happening here. So there can be discrimination from the society, discrimination by their extended family, difficulty with the mother-in-law. Families will exclude brides from decision-making. She doesn't have any power. She can't make money, maybe without her husband. If she wants money, she has to go and ask him for it. And so there's just a lot of issues here. And then on top of that, right now, there is no anti-discrimination law in play that is guaranteeing legal protection against discrimination for all citizens. Why? We mentioned this in a previous podcast. It's because this law that's currently being in discussion. I think they're going to vote on it in July. It's kind of sweeping, including minorities and people who are LGBTQ. And so this is kind of the biggest reason why there's pushback to this anti-discrimination law. Because as much as this shames me to say it, Christian groups in Korea are pushing back against that.
Right.
So this is why we don't have an anti-discrimination law currently in Korea. And on top of all of that, there's already this foundation of South Korea tending to treat domestic violence as just, family matters. You guys internally deal with it. It's embarrassing to share it with your friends or your society around you. So a lot of women already are inclined to stay silent when they're facing this kind of domestic troubles.
Yeah, but I do have to mention that there are positive steps, whether we think that they're big enough or not. At least there are some positive steps and implementations from the Korean government that are at play here. I was reading about there's I think it was 2 years ago, they set up at least 5 different counseling centers for victims of domestic abuse, specifically for foreign brides, and their plan was to up that to 7. Now, I don't know how big these centers are, or if they have enough resources for all of the potential victims, but that was something that they were proactively trying to put into play. I don't know if there are 7 now, or I don't know if COVID sort of
slowed things
down. But at least that was something that they were trying to implement. And also they launched a new emergency call line where foreign wives can use this line to report to the police in their own language. And the last I read, there were 13 languages offered at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. I mean, so again, I think another thing that, I don't know how effective this is, but another thing that the government is doing is they provide education for foreign wives.
I'm sure that's hugely effective.
Yeah. So
it's done properly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know what kind of education it is. Like, I mean, I'm assuming it's sort of a Korea culture 101. But I mean, honestly, in my opinion, if I can offer my opinion, it's like these husbands, they need to be educated.
I kind of agree with you.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, it's, again, I don't know how effective this is, but at least it is a sign that Korea is starting to face this and attack this issue head on, whether they wanted to initially or not, because it seemed like they were sort of just sweeping it under the rug for a while. But I mean, I guess with the internet now and with viral videos, you can't really just keep ignoring stuff like this.
No, you can't. And I really hope that they're going to get to the root of the issues and not just constantly, cover it on top. Because, I mean, the reality is, and it's important to keep some perspective here and not look at us like, oh, you guys are just bashing Korea. You guys are saying horrible things about Korean men. This is not at all what we're saying. You should listen a little closely if you really want to understand our heart, but really recognizing that there are women who are in really terrible situations, and by talking about it like this, bringing it up, people are now sharing those viral videos. As horrible as it is to see that with your eyes, the fact is that you suddenly have an impact and realize, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. And so if anything, at least it is waking people up to realize this maybe is my neighbor, or maybe my friend, or that woman who lives down the street. And maybe I should just be a little bit more compassionate to my neighbor and just be aware kind of what's happening and recognize that these are some realities that some women are living in today. So we do applaud Korea for taking steps forward, or at least the public raising an outcry against these abuses that are happening. So, of course, I don't want to end on a very low note by any means. And it is true that after some of these situations, the men's occupation, health, criminal records are now offered to the women. After 2014, there was a requirement, if you're going through these marriage brokers, to at least be able to have a language to communicate in with together. So they are steps forward. They're definitely steps forward. So we wanted to just share with you maybe some resources in case you think you are in this situation, or you would like to get more information or maybe some help in some way. You can check out liveinkorea.kr, live, L-I-V-E, inkorea.kr. And so they've got a lot of great resources in there, and not just about, domestic violence, but for a lot of people who are not Korean, maybe they don't have a Korean citizenship or don't speak Korean fluently. This is a really good resource for you. And then you can also check out the Tanuri helpline, TANUIR helpline. TANURI helpline.
I was spelling that out in my head.
Yeah. The number is 1577-1366. And this is where you can get domestic violence relief and follow-up. That is key. Emergency shelter. You can get counseling, interpretation, legal counseling. And they have a whole variety of languages where you can get this help in. So I thought that was really great that this has been established. So we didn't even get into talking about potential issues children in these kind of marriages might be facing. And we could talk about that in the future. Would have to do a lot more research, because unfortunately there isn't a whole lot of research on that aspect. But if you know more things and you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd of course love to hear from you. And once again, I just wanted to emphasize, when we're saying foreign brides, by no means are we lumping every single non-Korean woman who comes to Korea and gets married to a Korean guy. There's no way you can make blanket statements like that. All we want to know is that people are having healthy, loving, safe relationships to grow a healthy, loving, safe society. So now that I said loving, safe society, let's head over to listener mail. Okay. Well, we got loads of listener mail, which was so exciting to see. I get a little jump, a little thrill.
You love listener mail.
I do love listener mail.
I do too. But I think for you, it's just like,
it's like, whoa,
the greatest thing ever.
This is listener mail, And I say that every time a mail comes in.
Yeah.
Is the exact same thing. Whoa, this is listener mail. It's my thing.
Yeah, I can verify that.
Yeah, you've seen it. So I just wanted to read a couple of messages. Let's see here. Okay. We have one. This is on Instagram. So we released last week the episode about working in Korea. And a lot of people had a lot of questions about that. I'm sure we're going to have more questions come in, but we're just going to answer a few here. So this was one question that said, can you ask whether having a lot of tattoos can stop you from getting an ESL job?
Oh.
Do tattoos stop you from getting an ESL job?
It didn't stop me.
Because you don't have tattoos.
Exactly. No, so I guess it depends on where. But for example, if you want to teach just in the public school system through a program like EPIC, I know people who have tattoos that came over to teach, but there has to be a way to cover them. So you can't expose them in the class or at school. And so you have to actually let them know on the application. They do ask if you have tattoos. So I would imagine, So it doesn't. If anything, it might hurt your chances a bit if they, have a whole bunch of teachers or a pool to choose from. But I think if you're able to cover it and you're not like tatted up in your face, then you'll be okay. For the private school sector or the academy, hagwons, it probably just depends on the actual institution. As far as like higher learning or other forms of education, I'm not too aware. But yeah, it's definitely possible.
Nah, yeah, don't let that, consume your mind, thinking like, oh my gosh, I gotta learn how to contour and bake and put foundation on my tattoo every morning. You don't have
be
to
staining
do that.
everything you touch.
Yeah, you'll be fine. Yeah, just find a reputable school. That's what I'd be more concerned about. Okay, we got another great email here. This is, I believe she is a student. So she's responding to she's responding to a lot of videos here, but it seems that the first one is talking about when I was talking about prostitution in Korea. She said, thank you for speaking up about this difficult issue. I've been looking for this type of chill yet thoughtful video. A lot of Koreans, I think, don't even know about this. And then she just continues to talk about this. Thank you again. It's a long email, so this is kind of why I'm going through. She said, I recently found out about your channel, which is so helpful as well. I myself am Korean. My whole family members are Korean. But since I'm in an international relationship, I was so eager to find out about these types of information, basically just sharing ideas and feelings, which goes a little bit deeper than just couple vlogs. I hope all of your crew members are also finding this project therapeutic and interesting, and that you guys can make a lot more videos. Did you hear that, Michael and Jay? You guys,
Right.
Are you guys listening? And then she said, the video that led me to your channel was about this beautiful woman who is half Korean, half Berber. So this is talking about Hyun. My boyfriend is Moroccan, surprise.
Oh.
So I found it really rare, this half Korean or even half Asian, half Arabic people's story. So I was really curious about what you guys will say in this video. And then I also saw some other clips about half Egyptian, half Korean man who served in the Korean army, right?
She's going down the list of every
She
single video.
really is, yeah. Half Pakistani, half Korean brother and sister, which you guys talked about what it's like to grow up Muslim and Christian at the same time. So she just want to say thank you for your work. I find it hard to find maybe these unusual cases as well. And I hope you guys can deal with more cases of international relationships and their families, especially about Korean, Muslim, Arabic people as well. Because I've seen some cases with Korean men and Arabic women getting married, but Korean women to Arabic men, that's kind of hard to find. So sorry to talk too much, but thank you again for your wonderful, interesting, thought-provoking videos and the project as well. So Seolhyun, that's from Seolhyun. Thank you so much for sending in that message. That's I think it gives us a lot of encouragement.
Yeah, gives us energy to read stuff like that.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate that. Let me just read one last one, if that's okay. Okay? This is from Layla. Dear Halfie Project, my name is Layla and I am an Egyptian American teenager, and though I'm not a Halfie nor am I Korean, I really relate to many of the experiences shared in your podcasts. When I visit Egypt, I'm too American with my broken Arabic, and in America I look too Egyptian, so it's really interesting to see people who are completely different from me ethnic-wise to be so similar to me. I also love learning about the Korean culture, and I love that you talk about the good and not so positive aspects that people often overlook. So thank you, Becky, Jay, Cedric, and Michael.
Oh,
She knows
us all
everyone.
out.
Yeah, and everyone else. I really appreciate what you're doing. These podcasts really do get me through exam season, which is now. So thank you again, Layla.
Thank you, Layla.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know I've said this before too, but I really love it when we get messages from people who wouldn't put themselves in the category of mixed Korean.
Right.
And yet they feel very strongly, or they relate, or they just enjoy learning. That is so valuable and compassion filled. So it's so great to hear from you. Okay, that's all the listener mail I have today. We have more that we'll share next week. So be sure to tune in to the Halfie Project podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, and share this video. Leave us a comment below about what you guys think of today's topic and what you'd like us to talk about in the future. That being said, we are signing off here. Thanks for listening. We are the Halfie Project.